Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So, today we are going to talk about the United Healthcare CEO getting killed in New York because, of course, we have to. We will talk very briefly about the media and internet reactions to this murder and some of the whys of those reactions, and then a bit more about the murder itself, a little bit more directly in the second half of the episode. And that's because in the first half, I want to hit on something that I think is a much broader and more important topic to cover, which is kind of highlighted by this killing. So I'll say first that the killer, or what certainly appears to be the killer, has been apprehended in Pennsylvania, in Altoona, Pennsylvania. And we will have to deal with the outcome and everything that comes out of that as we go forward, but that's not terribly important for this episode. I'm not going to break it all down. It's been 4 or 5 days, maybe even 6 when this comes out, since the killing, and you've all seen that, or you can find it very easily. The central point of this episode will be social murder, this topic of social murder and mass social murder. And this is an analysis that I've seen a few people talk about, and I've seen a lot of people dance around, but I haven't seen any really dig into this and talk about it a lot for, a long time and really discuss what it really is. So I'm going to do my best here to do that. Okay, so before we address the killing, which is obviously the most salacious part of this, let's talk about social murder. This is a term coined by Friedrich Engels in his book The Conditions of the Working Class in England, which was published in 1845. And I'm pretty sure he was the one that coined it. I couldn't find anything earlier, so if some dead guy that nobody's ever heard of had coined this earlier, I apologize to him and his family. So there are 2 major quotes here that I want to read you from this book. One's pretty short and the other one's a little bit longer. Now, one note going into this, these words, as Engels wrote them, are more pertaining to capital, the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois class of people, a bourgeois government. And it's not directly talking about private health insurance because this was 1845 in England, right? But I think that the concepts that he talks about here, the concepts that deal with class and power, are really important, and the parallels will be pretty obvious when you hear them. Okay, so the first quote here, it's, quote, "During my residence in England, at least 20 or 30 persons have died of simple starvation under the most revolting circumstances, and a jury has rarely been found possessed of the courage to speak the plain truth in the matter. Let the testimony of the witnesses be never so clear and unequivocal. Sorry about that. The bourgeoisie from which the jury is selected always finds some back door through which to escape the frightful verdict, death from starvation. The bourgeoisie dare not speak the truth in these cases, for it would speak to its own condemnation. But indirectly, far more than directly, many have died of starvation where long-continued want of proper nourishment has called forth fatal illness, when it has produced such debility that causes which might otherwise have remained inoperative brought on severe illness and death. The English workingmen call this social murder, and accuse our whole society of perpetrating this crime perpetually. Are they wrong? No, Friedrich Engels, they are not wrong. Engels correctly analyzes here and argues that the powers that be, in his time, it was, like I said, the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois class, the bourgeois government, and industrialists, of course. In our day, it is a lot of the same people, right? We'll add a few more in modern times. There's still the industrialists and everything, but today we're talking about, in kind of connecting this to private health insurance companies who bring, all of this horror upon the populace. And we can even throw hospital systems in there as well. It's not just purely an insurance issue. It's problems up and down the healthcare system. So among all of these class dynamics, all of the enemies out there, right? Under, the color of the current so-called law, the rules that we operate under, right? Our society, our current cultural milieu, right? It is near impossible to not just, like Engels said, to find a jury to convict anybody for these things, but for anyone at all who could possibly possess the power to do so, they won't even go so far as to accuse, let alone charge the guilty. At best, some insurance company will be fined some amount of money that will, the raw number will be big, but it'll be far less than they made making these decisions that resulted in so many people dying and suffering, and even people taking their own lives in desperation. Even in that these companies make more money allowing people to die rather than care for them, then that alone has become meaning the death of the people that they're supposed to help. It's become their fiduciary responsibility to shareholders to let them die. Death becomes profit for these people. In the quote, Engels highlights in pretty concise detail, at least for him, for once, right, aspects of social murder that are easy to understand. Starvation, because they're poor. Nobody's helping them. Nobody's increasing their wages. They're just continuing to oppress. And these workers, they died of nothing but starvation and the weakness caused by starvation. And I guess most importantly, he frames this as a class issue. He discusses the misery and the deaths and the pain and just the abject poverty of the proletariat in this situation, of the workers, the sickness and starvations that they face and succumb to. And he points out that the cause of these hardships is the actual exploitation of these workers by the upper class and capitalism, by the bourgeoisie. He also highlights how the bourgeoisie not only are the ultimate cause of these privations, but they are the ones who most directly benefit from it, right? They profit from it. And we can obviously see the connections, I think, that can be made between this scenario, the industrial mid-1800s in England, and what we see with modern healthcare. Those with the power deny claims. They deny the medicine. They deny the scans and the treatments and oftentimes life itself. But because this sort of death, these killings, they happen off the screen. They happen far away. They're very hands off. We ignore it. Or we call it the price of doing business. We call it a hard choice that just had to be made. We have to think about how much it costs, right? We have to make the shareholders happy. And I reject that. I think that is horrible. I hope most of you agree that that's horrible, and that we should reject all of that. We should not accept such social murder as simply an unavoidable part of life. I should also point out that this term social murder highlights not just the corporate aspect, but the capitalist system as well. It is, after all, the driving force behind why these people are so desperate for profits that they will let people die. They will trade random, usually poor people's lives for more money. I also want to say that another aspect of the social and class dynamics here are the police response that we saw after the murder. Like if a bike messenger gets, shot on the sidewalk in front of a hotel in Midtown Manhattan, detectives start a folder, they start a case, and more often than not, the case does not get solved. The folder sits there untouched for months on end. Nothing happens. And, it's basically forgotten about until every year on the anniversary of that killing, the victim's mother or partner or sibling, they call that detective and say, are there any new leads? Are you doing anything? And the detective, he probably doesn't even open the folder again before he says, no, not really. It's been a year. It's been 2 years. It's been 3 years. They've given up on it. And that's how it goes on and on until the family or the loved one gives up. And then it's forgotten about. It's put in a box in its warehouse somewhere until, some point down the line they say, hey, you know what? This 100-year-old file, we're just going to throw it out. But when we see a wealthy, powerful man who, just gets capped on the sidewalk, right? Just like a bike messenger, it's all hands on deck. It's a multi-state manhunt. It's combing through every single second of surveillance footage you can find from the entire island of Manhattan. It doesn't matter. We have the manpower all of a sudden. The FBI steps in. The state police step in. Police agencies all over the country are lending help. They muster their forces like it's World War II. And the investigation would have gone on for months or even years without ever really slowing down. It might, it might have slowed down, but there always would have been somebody working on it. It would not have been backburnered for months. It wouldn't have been a dusty file somewhere in a drawer. You'd see multi-organization task forces working on this for as long as they possibly could, because a CEO for police, because of course police serve capital, we all know that. A CEO is far more important, like a billion times more important than a regular Joe, than a bike messenger. And one guy getting murdered is infinitely more important to the powers that be than thousands suffering and dying under a regime of social murder. Now, a lot of people will probably by now, if they've made it this far, already started rejecting the term social murder. They will argue that allowing someone to die is not the same as stabbing, shooting, or strangling them with their bare hands. And, I guess at the end of the day, I just disagree. And I think that social murder is a completely acceptable term and an acceptable framing for what we see both with healthcare, insurance, welfare systems, and, society at large, to be frank. This is what we do to each other. It's what we allow to happen to each other. Rhetorically, I think the term social murder has its uses as well. It's a polemic, right? It's meant to be. It's meant to incite people to think about what we are actually allowing to happen to each other, what we are allowing to happen to ourselves. I mean it as a polemic. I want you to hear it. And here's sorry about that. And here is the second, and this is a little bit more substantial of a quote. And bear in mind, again, what I said about the framing of enemies here being slightly different then than now, right, in 1845 to 2024. But this one is a bit long, so please bear with me. And also, please bear with me because Engels has a love affair with semicolons and long-ass sentences. And they read a little better on the page than they do being read out loud. All right, quote. When one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another such that death results, we call the deed manslaughter. When the assailant knew in advance that the injury would be fatal, we call his deed murder. But when society places hundreds of proletarians in such a position that they inevitably meet a too early and an unnatural death, one which is quite as much a death by violence as that by the sword or bullet, when it deprives thousands of the necessaries of life, places them under conditions which they cannot live, forces them, through the strong arm of the law, to remain in such conditions until that death ensues, which is the inevitable consequence, knows that these thousands of victims must perish, and yet permits these conditions to remain, its deed is murder, just as surely as the deed of the single individual. Disguised, malicious murder, murder against which none can defend himself, which does not seem what it is because no man sees the murder, because the death of the victim seems a natural one, since the offense is more one of omission than of commission. But murder it remains. I have now to prove that society in England daily and hourly commits what the working men's organs, with perfect correctness, characterize as social murder, that it has placed the workers under conditions in which they can neither retain health nor live long, that it undermines the vital force of these workers gradually, little by little, and so hurries them to the grave before their time. I have further to prove that society knows how injurious such conditions are to the health and the life of the workers, and yet does nothing to improve these conditions. That it knows the consequences of its deeds, that its act is, therefore, not mere manslaughter but murder, I shall have proved when I cite official documents, reports of Parliament, and of the government in substantiation of my charge. End quote. Now, I want to explain how we feel about social murder, or at least talk about it, is to think about the always famous and always mentioned trolley problem. Trolley problem. We've all heard it, right? It's there. The idea is that there's a trolley running down a track. It's going to hit 5 people and it's going to kill them. You are given the option as a bystander to throw a switch and send the trolley down an adjacent track with just one person on it who the trolley will kill. There's no other option. 5 die or 1 die. Now, famously, almost everybody, when they hear this problem, they say, yes, I will throw the switch. I will sacrifice that one person to save 5 or save 4, I guess, depends how you think about it. It's kind of a very classic thought experiment. But an interesting thing happens when you slightly change the parameters of the experiment. If you say that there's a trolley coming down the track, is going to run over 5 people and kill them, and you're standing on a bridge overlooking the track, and there's a person standing next to you, and if you push that person over the railing onto the track, they will die, but they will stop the trolley before it hits the 5 people, so you'll save their lives. When you do that, when you add the variable of you're pushing the human being in front of the train, people's decisions rapidly start to change. The outcome is exactly the same. 1 person dies instead of 5. But because the act of pushing somebody feels so much worse than flipping a switch, it puts us, at least in our mind, hands-on in the situation. It becomes murder to us. And we don't like that. We don't like how that makes us feel, even though throwing the switch is essentially the exact same thing. Throwing a switch and letting or allowing the trolley to run over 1 person, that's one thing. But pushing the actual physical form of a human being in front of the trolley to die is just another level that our minds just really have a hard time wrapping around. And I think that's pertinent here because this is how we view healthcare CEOs and insurance companies. This is how we talk about them doing their jobs. They're just flipping switches. They aren't killing people. They're simply allowing them to die. They're letting them die. And in this way, when we talk about it as allowing and letting murder, what should be rightfully considered murder, is transmogrified into, I guess, like mere misfortune, right? Like, it's sad it happened, but wish we could have done something. That's how you view it from afar. We start talking about actuarials and in numbers and percentages and bottom lines and costs, and suddenly death and murder becomes kind of like neat and clean and innocent. It becomes incidental. It becomes something that just happens. It's very passive. It becomes tragedy. And that tragedy becomes faultless. Death becomes like denuded of all of its pain and ugliness and horror and grief. These social murders become so acceptable to us precisely because of how removed we are from them. Removed by sometimes literal walls, like a bureaucracy of phone banks and people and paperwork and call centers and middlemen, and by actual distance, right? Often physical, like physical distance, miles. It's it even professional distance, right? Like, how do you deal with a CEO? How do you deal with executives who are making these decisions and pushing it down upon people who work in these cubicle phone banks? You can't. There's so much distance between you that you never get there. And all of this, by the way, all of this distancing, all of this siloing, it's done on purpose to keep us away from the people who make these decisions, and to keep us away from seeing those decisions so that we never become hands-on. And then, even if the few people who actually manage to, hack, slash, and cut their way through all that red tape and break down those walls and get through the phone banks to the CEOs and the executives and the people who can really make decisions, then you are met with teams of lawyers, just giant teams of them. And they're overflowing with the esoteric knowledge of the healthcare system and the insurance system and the contracts you signed, things you know nothing about. And they're funded with like literally tens of hundreds of millions of dollars just to make sure that they're able to deny, delay, and finally depose. So if they can't break us with all of the red tape and the phone calls and like the sanitized corporate decision making, then they break us financially. They break us with legal costs, which become added in addition to all of the medical costs that got us to this point. So we're already facing, all of those medical bills. Now we need the time, the energy, the knowledge to go into court when we're already facing like bankruptcy, right? Just from the medical bills. Now we have to add lawyer bills on top of it. It all sends us to that uniquely American netherworld that we call medical bankruptcy. It's something that happens almost never anywhere else in the world. It's just a bizarre, I want to say side effect, but it's not even a side effect. Well, it's like a metastasized like node, on the side of our health insurance industry. It's horrific. And, even for, like I said, for the people who have the time, the strength, and the resources to actually fight them in court, the entire time that you're trying to do this, the victim, the defendant, is often still dying. They're still suffering. They're still in pain. They're still coming closer to death. They're still, being emotionally bludgeoned by these awful, evil bastards in these Sorry, I'm trying to not to use too many expletives here, but in these horrific insurance companies and their legal teams, the people that these things are affecting, that either they're fighting for themselves or their families fighting for them, they are dying. Or sometimes the victim has already died, and the family is left to, scrabble and crawl and somehow fight on. We as a society don't see the bodies that are made from these social murders. And we certainly aren't in on the decisions that lead so many to these early pain-ridden deaths. We see them as individuals. We might see our own friends and family members hurt by these things. Or, we see them as collectively as families and friend groups when we see somebody suffer like this. But both the health insurance industry and society and our cultures, they prevent us, like they actively try to prevent us. They discourage us, openly, actively discourage us from experiencing this as a societal issue, right? It's always, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you. All of this stuff, and I'm not trying to take away individual grief here, but all of that stuff is happening to all of us. We're all affected by this stuff. So with this distance, this like socioeconomic based social murder becomes acceptable, just like throwing a switch is more acceptable than pushing somebody, right? We know that they're throwing switches, but we accept it. And this whole issue, it becomes more pronounced when people who make these decisions, who deny these claims, who deny these services, the medicine, the general healthcare claims, all of whom have the benefit of, those same levels of barriers and distances to protect them. When those people make a profit from their decisions, when they are clearly incentivized to make those decisions become ever easier to make. If we are so easily accepting of these social murders and we suffer from the most of it, and by we, I'm saying the working Joes here, the proletariat, then how easy must it be to justify all of these social murders when it makes you so much money to do them? The point here, I think, is that death, and I'm talking about early death resulting from, insurance choices and also all of the suffering that goes with it as well. But, this pain and this death is a choice. It's always choices. They are all choices which are actively made. They sit down and they decide what they're going to do. They put forth policies. They decide on those policies. They don't have to follow them. It's not handed down by God. They make these decisions. Switches being thrown all around these cubicle offices and boardrooms. Except, I guess these switches don't save 5 lives in exchange for 1, right? They cost lives in exchange for money. They transmute lives into cash via death. And that is pretty sad. Distance makes the deaths from all of these choices, these social murders, tragedies. They aren't tragedies. They are social murders. Tragedies are car crashes, things people can't help. These can be helped. We can accept tragedy. We can accept, death from earthquakes and hurricanes and car crashes and random accidents that are uncontrollable or barely controllable. We can accept, unavoidable death, right? There are just some things that you can't come back from. But we should never accept letting people or allowing powerful people to choose to let people die, aka let those people kill people for profit. It's not like a social tragedy. It's not an accident. It's not a social accident. It's social murder. It's a social choice. And when we choose, it becomes murder. Now, let's talk about the actual killing and the reaction to it as we kind of start winding this down, I guess. So first, the reaction, real briefly. The sort of mainstream, I guess, media and liberal and conservative media story, I guess, is largely reacting with the same sort of holier than thou and very belittling, like, civility nonsense that they actually always do, right? This man had a family. Oh, I can't believe that you're laughing. Well, the internet, they reacted with absolute glee. So why these reactions? And why are they so different? Well, the media and their benefactors simply can't believe that a wealthy and powerful man could be gunned down in the streets. Even more shocking, at least to them, is that this rich, powerful man was murdered with an agenda. He was assassinated. The mainstream media also has gone out of their way to demean those who made light of his death. And there were a lot of people making light of it. They are downplaying, I think, just how significant of a moment this is for regular people, the working class, the proletariat, and so forth, to rally around. I don't think it's going to spark a revolution or anything, but I do think it was significant. And they want anybody who felt even the slightest tingle of justice or, humor or irony or whatever they felt about this, they want them to feel bad about having those feelings. They want them to turn from that feeling. This is, to my eyes at least, the elite class trying to protect itself. They are trying to convince us and to train us that those feelings are wrong. And I don't think that they're wrong. I kind of laughed a little bit. So shells that were left at the scene of the murder had the words deny, delay, and depose written on them, which is a direct reference to, one, a book title, but also the well-known and well-documented tactic of insurance companies to deny every claim that they can, delay the victim by any means necessary, and then if it comes to it, to depose them in a lawyer's office, all in a bid to break these people down and to not have to pay the claim. These absolute monsters rely on regular people not having the money, time, and specialized knowledge to fight them. They kill by financial, emotional, and temporal and psychological attrition. Basically, they terrorize sick people or the families of sick people until they give up. So yeah, a man was killed, right? I'm not super thrilled to see people die. I don't cheerlead death. Most people, I don't think, are really cheering that Brian, like the human being, like the dad, the father, whatever, that he was killed. But we also have to acknowledge how many people that this guy named Brian, who's also a CEO of a gigantic healthcare company, we have to acknowledge how many people he was directly responsible for harming and killing through systemic inaction, which was hard-coded into the business that he ran, which was ostensibly, at least, meant to heal people. And we need to reckon as a society with whether killing a single man on the street is somehow far worse than killing thousands from a boardroom. The oligarchy will gnash its teeth and rend its clothing just with the knowledge that we could even ask that question, that question even exists in our minds. They judge us as disturbed, sick, or just as base, bloodlusted animals. But we aren't the ones who are justifying, siphoning every last penny from sick and dying people and then continuing to assault them in their memories, in their families, by doing the same to the surviving members of that family. So I guess what I ask here is whether violence used to stop this sort of social murder, is it a step too far? If this CEO had stabbed people with a knife to save his company money, to enrich himself and the shareholders, how much worse would that be than simply watching them die to save money, to enrich himself, and to enrich the shareholders? Now, I think about, if some guy out there had hurt children, I'll leave it up to you to just however you want to take that. I'm not going to detail it. But the authorities, such as they are, refuse to not just arrest a guy, but even to deal with it, right? And he's hurting a lot of children. And then a parent of one of those kids found him in the street and killed him. You'd all be cheering. We'd all be cheering. We'd say, good. I might not, say murder is not the best way to solve all of these things, but screw it. The guy was hurting children. Nobody was doing anything about it. He's gone. You'd all understand. It would not seem complicated to you at all. Well, insurance CEOs are harming children every day. Every single day. Every day they deny claims and children suffer. Every day children are dying because of what insurance companies do. The internet has been, rife with these stories for years. Social media has been for, decades as well, just full of these horrific stories of insurance companies torturing families and people dying because of it. And over the past few days, social media has been absolutely flooded with even more of them. And every one of these stories, it contains at least one victim, right? One direct victim, not to mention all the families who've been broken financially by these things. And there are, like I said, thousands, tens of thousands of these stories out there. Easily searchable for anybody who cares to look. But because these killers wear ties, because they wear sweater vests and, pantsuits, and because they work in a boardroom and they have shareholders to deal with and they're wealthy and powerful, and they mask their decisions, they mask their violence behind a very thin veil of fiduciary responsibility, we say, hey, that's just business. It's a shame, but it's just business. Hard decisions had to be made, and they made them. And, it is business. It's a violent, harmful business, which simply does not need to exist. It literally does not need to exist. Just take care of people. Somebody's hurt, just send them to a hospital, single payer. It's all done. You pay enough for the hospitals to stay open. You pay enough for doctors to do the job, and that's it. Insurance is basically nonsense. We don't need, or private insurance is nonsense. We don't need it. It's pure rentiering. It's pure profiteering. It's purely a money-soaking middleman, and it's an unnecessary construct in the system. It's an industry which adds absolutely nothing to society except pain, stress, anxiety, financial, emotional, and psychological instability, torture, trauma, suffering, and yes, even death. We are lied to about a supposed necessity of insurance. Meanwhile, nearly every other country in the world doesn't deal with this stuff, at least in the way we do, right? Some have insurance systems, but they are nothing like what we do here in the United States. All these other nations, They just take care of their citizens. They go to the doctor, the hospital, they have surgeries, dental work, hearing aids and glasses. Yes, you heard that right. Civilized countries consider teeth part of the human body. They consider eyes part of the human body. They consider ears part of the human body. You don't need to have different insurance for those parts of your body. They are just included in your health care. And yeah, I know how shocking that is for the American ear to hear. The American, and they get minimal, if any, bills, even while their teeth are taken care of for free. Are all of those systems perfect? Are any of them perfect? No, of course not. But they're all far better than what we get here in the United States. They get better health outcomes with less cost. And obviously, they don't have all this social murder, right? And the just the suffering that comes along with it. Now, as for the killing, I don't think that, like I said before, I don't think that most people are reacting to the killing with glee because just somebody was killed on the street. That's never good. I don't think most people are even really thrilled that this human being named Brian died. Hey, they didn't know Brian. None of us knew Brian, if I'm being real. Nobody who's going to see this did, right? Brian wasn't the guy next door. What they are happy about is that anybody at all involved in the violent, immoral, and frankly murderous insurance industry was finally held to some sort of account for the horrors that they all oversee. Now, many of these people who feel this way would rather something have been done to people like these CEOs in the preceding century, decade, year, month, weeks, days, hours before this death. But nothing ever happened over that time. So we'll take what we can get. And that might seem pretty messed up, but that's what we've been driven to. And I think the reality we have to deal with is that, yes, it was that bad for a regular human being who gets sick in this system or badly injured in this country. It really is that bad to see people you love and care about getting screwed over by these absolute monsters in their C-suites and Midtown Manhattan meetings. This goofball of a CEO, he chose to spend his professional career choosing to allow people to die so that he could make shareholders wealthy, and he became a symbol of the hatred we have of everything he was doing the moment that he got shot. This CEO was nobody to most of the country. Very few people who celebrated his death knew his name before he was dead. Basically, none of them knew what he looked like, right? Let alone actually truly cared for this guy. None of us had ever met him. He's not our homie. He's not in our family. He's not, he's not even our neighbor. We don't live in the kind of neighborhood that he probably didn't even live in a neighborhood, if we're being real. He lived in a house that was a half mile from the next house. So even at that point, right, we don't really care. He's nobody to us. He was, to be kind of blunt, nobody to most of the people in this country. He being that man named Brian. But in his death, he came to symbolically represent a brutal, immoral, and deadly industry that everybody pretty universally despises. So, one, almost nobody knew the guy or cared about him. Two, he became a symbol of something that we nearly universally despise, that we hate. And the murder became sort of a symbolic murder, right? A punishment for all of that social and societal pain that he and others like him have put upon the populace. Right or wrong, this is what this CEO and his murder came to mean to people. The hate that we see, even if it seems so, I don't think is really directed at the man Brian, not at the man as a sort of human being. It seems more directed at like CEO of massive corporation that's part of an industry that degrades, tortures, and murders through actions and inactions many hundreds or thousands of mostly poor people every year. That's the guy that we're reacting to. And if you add to that many seeing some measure of accountability for all of those social murders being meted out on that New York street in a country that largely fails to punish the rich and powerful, and you end up with widespread glee, right? We're all just people cheering in the streets and making funny memes on the internet. So while the media and the other insurance executives and the politicians cried their crocodile tears, and while the police tracked their prey, the regular citizens, they raised this guy, Luigi Mangione, I think is how you say it, to a folk hero status. Again, they claimed that they claimed that what the media is calling sort of a sick perversion of justice, they claimed it as actual justice. But the man that the media, by doing this, by framing it how they do, that they seek to protect, this Brian Thompson fella, he was a man who made himself wealthy by overseeing the suffering and the death of people. And he was a person who ruined the lives of the surviving members of the families of the people that died under his watch. That's literally what he did. It's what he chose every day. It's what his job was. And I should add here that this supposedly amazing guy, amazing dad, amazing friend, whatever other nonsense they're saying, he was also under investigation for over $15 million in insider trading fraud. So, yeah, this is who Brian Thompson was. And because of all of that, he oversaw, as we can see from Luigi's words, I guess, he oversaw the pain and suffering of one particular man's family. And sure, fine, he wasn't, personally doing it. He wasn't sticking a knife into anybody himself. But he ran the company. He decided on its policies, and ultimately the buck stops there. And after all of that, because of all of that, he ended up getting domed by the man whose family he hurt and who he hurt directly, and the country cheered. And no matter how much the media tells us that he was a good man, a good dad, a good friend, a good brother, a good son, and all that other stuff, and I'll stipulate to all of that. I'm sure he was a cool guy to hang out with if you were also rich and shared interests with him, right? But when you're walking down the street and you catch a few hot ones in the back, and you're killed by an assassin, and the general response of the entire country is to cheer and laugh and celebrate, well, dog, you lived a pretty fucked up life. And that's just the reality of it, right? That's the judgment of the populace. We cheered. That's where the story ended for this CEO. So when we look at the many the many who have been harmed by insurance, or people who've seen others harmed by insurance, I think we can start to understand that. I guess we can understand the more personal vitriol and attacks on, not just Thompson, but everybody involved in insurance. When I had shoulder surgery a couple years ago and I couldn't get any money for like 5 months from my insurance, I had actual dreams, really good dreams, because I was very angry at the time, but I had dreams about driving, like renting a car and driving to Arizona where the Matrix healthcare building was that contained the person that I was talking to. And I had dreams of happily and gleefully throwing a Molotov cocktail through the front window. The anger when you're dealing with these people gets very real very fast. And the issues I had were not even remotely as bad as those of our friend Luigi here, if his words can be believed. I'm just saying that I understand. And I do want to caution, I guess, anyone who felt like this was, a big deal as far as raising class consciousness or just getting people talking about the deep injustice that is our healthcare and insurance system, to not let this event become like a pressure release valve. This is what the media and the elite want from us right now. They want us to vent for a little bit, to share memes and laugh and joke about it, and then maybe even feel bad about it later, right? And then move on with our lives. They do it with politicians all the time. When corruption hits levels high enough to anger people, they sacrifice one of their own, some senator or congressperson or governor or, a mayor from a big city. He goes down hard, and the fellow corrupt politicians who are able to hide it a little bit more, they step aside and they let it happen. Sometimes they even encourage it. But, those people, they don't go to prison or anything, right? They're just have to take a step back from public life for a year or two before they make their big comeback. But these people are willing to let one of their own get punished to appease the crowds and to relieve some pressure, to take away some of the anger, to let us feel like, oh, thank God they did something finally. And then they just go and do more corrupt shit, and they let the pressure build, and then eventually somebody else has to take the fall. They do it in the government, and they do it in corporate America as well. Now, obviously, this isn't that. I don't think that Cigna or Blue Cross or some meeting of the 10 families of insurance got together and put a hit out on a fellow CEO to bleed pressure from society, or did they? I'm just saying, look into it, right? But this death, this murder, this assassination, it can function just the same, right? It can be that pressure relief valve that these people occasionally need, and they're already trying to take advantage of that aspect of the aftermath. Some people, might listen to this and ask, well, this sounds a little bit like justification. It's gone beyond analysis at some points and veered, right into justification. And maybe it has. I don't know. I'm not trying to go too ham here, but if I were to justify this, I'd say this. When corporations and the CEOs who run them are actively trying to socially harm you, they're making you suffer, and they are committing mass social murder, and you fight back, then it's self-defense. That's a justification. That's what I would say. Now, is it effective self-defense? I don't really think so. Luigi killed a CEO, so basically what he did is he made a new CEO, right? The king is dead. Long live the king. There's always another king. Now, at least in my opinion, vigilantism, I don't think is all that wonderful. We'd be better off if people didn't feel like they had to do this. But I think that vigilantism itself is the result of a failed society, of a failed culture. A righteous, fair, well-developed society would have no need for a vigilante. A society like that would be taking care of its citizens from the jump when they got hurt, and they wouldn't be getting massive bills. They wouldn't allow unnecessary middleman industries to murder its citizens, and there would be no need for, vigilante assassins to take justice into their own hands, because the grievances simply would not be there. And we now know, via, this Luigi fella's own words, at least some of the reasons for doing what he did. We know why he committed murder on that Manhattan sidewalk. But what we also know is who denies medical treatment, who tortures and even kills hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people every year and decade via social murder. And that is the private insurance industry, which is made up of companies run by people like this CEO who got splattered across the sidewalk. And so I guess what I ask you as we finish this episode, this video, which murderer in this situation is more important to find and take to justice? Who in this equation is truly more dangerous? The lone gunman or the mass social murdering CEO?